Picture this: an 8-year-old limping toward a golden throne as priests chant, and the uraeus sears his brow. Overnight, he's a living god and a pawn, sick, lonely, and destined to be erased. So how does a boy no one was meant to remember become the most famous pharaoh on earth? Stay. Tutankhamun's real story is darker than gold. Before diving into this forgotten story of power and tragedy, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. But to understand how an 8-year-old boy came to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, we must first journey into one of the most turbulent periods in ancient Egyptian history, a time when the very foundations of 3,000 years of tradition were shaken by a pharaoh so radical, so revolutionary, that his own people would spend generations trying to erase every trace of his existence. This pharaoh was Akhenaten, and he was quite possibly your father. Akhenaten had done the unthinkable. In a civilization where the gods were as numerous as the stars, where every aspect of life was governed by ancient rituals and traditions, he had declared that there was only one god worthy of worship. The Aten, the solar disk, became the sole deity of Egypt under his reign. Overnight, thousands of years of religious tradition were cast aside. The great temples of Amun-Ra at Karnak fell silent. Priests who had held power for generations found themselves unemployed. The entire social structure of Egypt was turned upside down, but Akhenaten's revolution went far beyond religion. He abandoned Thebes, the traditional capital, and built an entirely new city called Akhenaten in the middle of the desert. Modern archaeologists know this place as Amarna. Here, in this purpose-built capital, Akhenaten ruled with his beautiful wife Nefertiti, creating art and poetry dedicated to their one god, while the empire crumbled around them. Trade routes were neglected. Military campaigns were abandoned. Egypt's vassal states in Syria and Palestine sent desperate letters begging for help against invading armies. But these pleas for aid went unanswered, as the heretic pharaoh focused entirely on his spiritual revolution. The Amarna letters, as historians call them, paint a picture of an empire in crisis. Local rulers who had been loyal to Egypt for generations watched helplessly as their territories were overrun by enemies. They wrote letter after letter to the pharaoh, each one more desperate than the last. "Send troops," they begged. "Send gold. Send weapons. Send anything." But the pharaoh who had once commanded the mightiest army in the ancient world was too busy composing hymns to the sun god to care about earthly concerns like defending his empire. Into this world of religious upheaval and political chaos, you were born. The exact circumstances of your birth remain one of history's great mysteries. Some evidence suggests Akhenaten was your father, though this is heavily debated among Egyptologists. What seems more certain is that you were born into the royal family during the height of the Amarna period, when Egypt was ruled from that strange desert city dedicated to the Aten. Your early childhood would have been unlike that of any previous Egyptian prince. Instead of learning about the traditional gods of Egypt, the complex pantheon that had guided Egyptian civilization for millennia, you were taught that only the Aten mattered. Instead of studying the time-honored traditions of pharaonic rule, you lived in a world where everything was new, experimental, revolutionary. The art on the palace walls showed the royal family in unprecedented intimacy, depicted with elongated skulls and feminine features that broke every artistic convention of ancient Egypt. But revolutions, even religious ones, have a way of consuming their creators. By the time you were 6 years old, cracks were beginning to show in Akhenaten's brave new world. The economy was struggling without the wealth that had once flowed from Egypt's empire. The priesthood, driven underground but not destroyed, plotted their return to power. The military, neglected and demoralized, began to question their loyalty to a pharaoh who seemed more interested in theology than in defending Egypt's borders. Then, sometime around your 7th birthday, everything changed. Akhenaten disappeared from history as suddenly and mysteriously as he had transformed Egypt. Some scholars believe he died of natural causes. Others suggest he was assassinated by those who opposed his reforms. Still, others think he may have been forced to abdicate in favor of a more traditional ruler. What we know for certain is that by 1332 BC, the heretic Pharaoh was gone, and Egypt needed a new king. But here's where the story becomes even more complex and tragic. You weren't supposed to be Pharaoh. In the normal course of events, you would have been a minor prince, perhaps eventually given a governorship of some distant province. Living out your days in comfortable Amarna revolution had disrue obscurity. But Thep did the normal succession. Several potential heirs had died or disappeared. The royal bloodline, already complicated by the intermarriage common among Egyptian royalty, had become even more tangled by the chaos of Akhenaten's reign. And so, at the tender age of 8, you found yourself thrust onto the throne of the most powerful nation on earth. Imagine trying to comprehend the weight of that responsibility. You were expected to rule over millions of subjects, command vast armies, make decisions that would affect the lives of countless people. Yet you could barely read hieroglyphics, had never led so much as a chariot ride, and probably still needed help getting dressed in the morning. The coronation ceremony that made you pharaoh would have been a bewildering spectacle for a child. Ancient Egyptian coronations were complex rituals designed to transform a mortal man into a living god. You would have been dressed in the finest linen, adorned with gold jewelry worth more than most people could imagine, and presented with the symbols of pharaonic power: the crook and flail, the double crown, the false beard that marked divine kingship. But perhaps the most overwhelming moment would have been when the priest placed the uraeus, the golden cobra, upon your brow. This wasn't just jewelry, it was the symbol of the pharaoh's power to destroy Egypt's enemies with divine fire. For a grown man, wearing the uraeus was an awesome responsibility. For an 8-year-old child, it must have felt like carrying the weight of the entire world on his small shoulders. The first challenge you faced as pharaoh was also the most fundamental. What kind of king would you be? Would you continue your predecessor's revolutionary policies, maintaining the worship of the Aten and ruling from the desert city of Akhenaten? Or would you abandon the reforms that had thrown Egypt into chaos and return to the traditional ways that had made Egypt great? This wasn't really your decision to make. At 8 years old, you were a pharaoh in name only. Real power lay in the hands of your advisors, chief among them a man named Ai and another called Horemheb. These were seasoned politicians and military commanders who had survived the turbulent Amarna period and now saw an opportunity to restore Egypt to its former glory. But their vision of restoration came at a terrible personal cost to you. Within the first few years of your reign, you were forced to make a series of decisions that must have been emotionally devastating for a child. The city where you had been born and raised, Akhenaten, was abandoned. The god you had been taught to worship, the Aten, was demoted from supreme deity to minor solar god. Your very name, Tutankhaten, which meant living image of the Aten, was changed to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Amun, honoring the traditional god whose worship your father had tried to destroy. Imagine how confusing and traumatic this must have been. Everything you'd been taught about the world, about the gods, about your own identity, was suddenly declared wrong. The religion of your childhood was branded as heresy. The city where you had learned to walk and talk was left to the desert sands. Even your name, that most basic marker of identity, was taken from you and replaced with something that honored the very forces your father had opposed. But the psychological trauma of religious conversion was nothing compared to the political pressures you faced. Egypt was still reeling from the chaos of the Amarna period. The empire that had once stretched from Sudan to Syria was in shambles. Vassal states had declared independence or been conquered by enemies. The Egyptian treasury, once overflowing with tribute from subject peoples, was depleted. The military neglected during Akhenaten's reign was demoralized and poorly equipped. Your advisors decided that the only way to restore Egypt's power was through military action. This meant that you, despite being barely into your teens, would need to lead campaigns to reconquer the lost territories of Egypt's empire. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs were expected to be warrior kings, personally leading their armies into battle. This wasn't just political necessity, it was religious requirement. The pharaoh was the earthly representative of Horus, the falcon god of war, and he needed to prove his divine favor through military victory. But how do you prepare a child for war? How do you teach a boy who should be playing with toys to command armies and make life and death decisions? The answer, it seems, was through a carefully managed propaganda campaign designed to present you as a mighty warrior king while keeping you safely away from actual combat. Relief carvings from your reign show you in the traditional pose of pharaonic triumph, standing in your war chariot with bow drawn, trampling Egypt's enemies beneath your horse's hooves. But these images were pure fiction. Artistic conventions repeated from the reigns of truly martial pharaohs like Thutmose III and Rameses II. The reality was far different and far more tragic. You were a puppet king, a child whose name and image were used to legitimize policies decided by others. When Egyptian armies marched north to reclaim lost territories in Syria and Palestine, you might have accompanied them for ceremonial purposes. But the real military decisions were made by experienced generals like Horemheb. When diplomatic correspondence was sent to foreign rulers, it bore your seal and your titles. But the words were chosen by advisors who had been navigating international politics since before you were born. This is where your story becomes truly heartbreaking. You were the most powerful person in the ancient world, at least in theory. Your word was law throughout the Nile Valley and beyond. Millions of people bowed when they heard your name, yet you had less real control over your own life than the humblest peasant farmer. Every decision that mattered was made for you. Every policy that bore your name was crafted by others. You were simultaneously the most important and most powerless person in Egypt. The loneliness must have been crushing. Picture yourself at 10 years old, sitting on the golden throne of Egypt while advisors twice your age debate matters you barely understand. The throne room of Memphis stretches endlessly before you, its painted columns depicting previous pharaohs conquering enemies and receiving tribute from foreign lands. But those pharaohs were men who had earned their power through decades of training, warfare, and political maneuvering. You were just a child playing dress-up in clothes that were far too big for you. Your daily routine was a carefully choreographed performance designed to maintain the illusion of divine kingship. Each morning, priests would wake you before dawn for the ritual cleansing that prepared you to greet the sun god. Your body would be washed with sacred water from the Nile, anointed with oils blessed in the temple, and dressed in linen so fine it was nearly transparent. The ceremonial beard would be strapped to your chin, the heavy crown placed upon your head, and you would be led to the palace balcony to perform the morning greeting to Ra as he began his daily journey across the sky. But these weren't moments of spiritual connection or divine communion. They were elaborate theatrical productions where you played the starring role without understanding the script. The prayers you recited had been written by priests who viewed you as a convenient vessel for their own return to power. The rituals you performed were designed to erase the last traces of your father's religious revolution and restore the old gods to their former glory. Every word you spoke, every gesture you made was carefully coached and monitored by men who had no interest in your personal happiness or well-being. The marriage they arranged for you epitomizes the tragic nature of your entire reign. When you were still a child, probably around 9 years old, your advisors decided you needed a queen to legitimize your rule and ensure the continuation of the royal bloodline. The bride they chose was your half-sister Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She was only a few years older than you, but in the twisted logic of royal succession, this marriage made perfect political sense. Ankhesenamun had originally been married to Akhenaten himself, making her simultaneously your stepmother and your bride. This arrangement, shocking by modern standards, was not unusual for Egyptian royalty, who believed that keeping the bloodline pure required marriage within the immediate family. But for two children who had already lost so much, who had seen their world turned upside down by religious revolution and political upheaval, this forced marriage represented another layer of trauma and isolation. The wedding ceremony would have been magnificent and hollow. Thousands of guests would have witnessed the union of the young pharaoh and his sister bride, celebrating the restoration of traditional royal customs after the chaos of the Amarna period. But behind the golden masks and ceremonial grandeur, two children were being forced into an adult relationship they could neither understand nor escape. Your bride had already endured marriage to her own father. You were being thrust into the complex dynamics of royal matrimony before you had even reached adolescence. The pressure to produce an heir must have been overwhelming. The entire point of your marriage was to create the next generation of pharaohs, to ensure that the royal bloodline would continue despite the disruptions of recent years. Palace physicians would have monitored your wife's monthly cycles. Priests would have performed fertility rituals, and the entire court would have been watching for signs of pregnancy that would secure the dynasty's future. But tragedy stalked your royal house like a curse from the gods themselves. Akhenaten did become pregnant, not once but twice during your brief reign. The joy these pregnancies must have brought to a court desperate for stability was matched only by the devastating sorrow that followed. Both of your daughters were born prematurely and died within days of their birth. Their tiny mummified remains were found in your tomb centuries later, silent witnesses to the personal grief that accompanied your public role as divine pharaoh. Imagine the weight of those losses on your young shoulders. You were already carrying the burden of ruling an empire, managing the expectations of powerful advisors, and maintaining the facade of divine authority. Now you also had to endure the death of your children while continuing to project strength and confidence to your subjects. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs were supposed to be blessed by the gods, protected by divine favor, guaranteed success in all their endeavors. Yet your most fundamental duty as king, producing an heir to continue the dynasty, had ended in heartbreak and death. The court physicians would have offered explanations for these tragedies that reflected the medical understanding of the time. Perhaps the queen had not properly honored Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Maybe the royal couple needed to make additional offerings to Isis, the divine mother who protected women in labor. Or possibly the deaths were punishment for the religious sins of the Amarna period, divine retribution that would continue until Egypt had fully atoned for Akhenaten's heresy. But we now know the likely truth was far more prosaic and far more tragic. Modern analysis of your mummy and those of your family members reveals the devastating consequences of generations of inbreeding among Egyptian royalty. The practice of marrying within the immediate family, designed to keep the bloodline pure and prevent outsiders from claiming the throne, had instead filled that bloodline with genetic defects that made healthy offspring increasingly unlikely. Your own body bore the marks of these hereditary problems. CT scans of your mummy reveal a host of physical abnormalities: a cleft palate, a curved spine, a deformed foot that would have caused you to walk with a pronounced limp. The numerous walking sticks found in your tomb weren't ceremonial objects, but necessary medical equipment for a young king, whose body was failing him even as he tried to project divine strength to his subjects. The irony is heartbreaking. You were worshipped as a living god, believed to possess supernatural powers that could ensure Egypt's prosperity and defeat its enemies. Yet your own body was so damaged by genetic inheritance that you needed help walking. You were expected to lead armies into battle while struggling with chronic pain and physical disability. The gap between the divine pharaoh of public imagination and the suffering child of private reality must have been almost unbearable. Your advisors worked tirelessly to hide these weaknesses from public view. Official art from your reign continues the traditional depiction of pharaonic perfection, showing you as a strong and healthy young king engaged in hunting, warfare, and religious ceremonies. The famous golden mask found on your mummy presents an idealized face of serene beauty and divine authority. But beneath these carefully crafted images lay the reality of a physically compromised teenager struggling to fulfill impossible expectations. The political situation during your reign remained precarious, despite the best efforts of your advisors to restore Egypt's power and prestige. The empire was slowly being rebuilt through military campaigns that reclaimed some of the territories lost during the Amarna period. Diplomatic relationships with foreign powers were carefully reconstructed through letters and treaties that presented Egypt as still the dominant force in the ancient Near East. But these achievements came at enormous cost, both to the Egyptian treasury and to your personal well-being. You were the public face of this restoration, the symbol around which Egypt's recovery was organized. Every military victory was attributed to your divine favor. Every diplomatic success was presented as evidence of your wisdom and power. Every sign of returning prosperity was credited to your restoration of the traditional gods in the old ways. But you knew, even as a teenager, that these successes belonged to others while the failures would ultimately be blamed on you. The isolation of your position was perhaps the cruelest aspect of your reign. You were surrounded by people who needed you to be successful but had no investment in your personal happiness. Your advisors wanted a compliant figurehead who would legitimize their policies. Your priests wanted a pharaoh who would restore their temples and their influence. Your military commanders wanted a king who would provide them with resources for their campaigns. But none of them wanted to know about your fears, your pain, your longing for a normal childhood that had been sacrificed to political necessity. Even your marriage, which might have provided emotional support and companionship, was primarily a political arrangement designed to serve the dynasty rather than your personal needs. Akhenaten was as trapped by circumstances as you were, forced into a role she had never chosen, expected to produce heirs for a kingdom that had already taken everything else from both of you. Whatever genuine affection may have developed between you was overshadowed by the constant pressure to fulfill your royal duties and the devastating grief of losing your children. As you entered your late teens, the physical problems that had plagued you since childhood began to worsen. The walking sticks in your tomb suggest increasing mobility issues. The medicines and surgical instruments buried with you indicate ongoing medical treatment for various ailments. But perhaps most telling are the numerous amulets and magical objects included in your burial goods, desperate attempts to provide in death the protection and healing that had eluded you in life. Your advisors must have begun to worry about succession as your health declined. You were still young enough that recovery was possible, but the pattern of genetic problems in your family line made it clear that even if you survived to adulthood, producing healthy heirs would be extremely difficult. The 2 infant daughters buried in your tomb served as grim reminders of the dynasty's reproductive challenges. Plans needed to be made for what would happen if you died without a surviving heir. The weight of these succession concerns must have pressed down on you, like the massive stone blocks of the pyramids your ancestors had built. Every cough, every stumble, every moment of weakness was scrutinized by courtiers who whispered behind painted fans about what would happen to Egypt if their young pharaoh failed to reach adulthood. The very people who depended on your divine authority were simultaneously planning for your demise, a paradox that would have been crushing for any teenager to comprehend. Your daily existence became a careful balance between maintaining royal dignity and managing chronic illness. The mourning rituals that transformed you from suffering boy to divine pharaoh required increasingly elaborate preparation. Servants skilled in the arts of concealment would paint your face to hide the pallor of sickness, arrange your clothing to disguise your physical limitations, and position you in ways that projected strength while accommodating your body's failing systems. Every public appearance was a performance where the slightest mistake could shatter the illusion of divine invincibility that held your kingdom together. The irony of your situation would have been apparent even to your young mind. You ruled the richest, most powerful nation on earth, commanded armies that stretched across continents, owned treasures beyond imagination. Yet you couldn't control the pain in your own body or the weakness in your own limbs. Peasants working in the Nile's fertile fields enjoyed better health than their god king. Slaves building monuments to your eternal glory possessed physical strength you could never match. The divine Pharaoh, who was supposed to embody perfection, was trapped in a body that betrayed him daily. Your relationship with the traditional gods that your reign had restored must have been complicated by this cruel contradiction. You had abandoned the Atean worship of your childhood to embrace Amun-Ra and the ancient pantheon, partly from political necessity but perhaps also from desperate hope that the old gods might provide the healing and strength that Akhenaten's single deity had failed to deliver. The temples you rebuilt and the priests you empowered were invested with your resources and your faith, yet the gods remained silent in the face of your suffering. The religious festivals that marked your reign became elaborate theater productions where you played the central role, despite your physical limitations. During the Opet festival, when the sacred bark of Amun-Ra traveled from Karnak to Luxor, you would have been carried in your own golden shrine, hidden from public view but symbolically present as the god's earthly representative. The crowds would have cheered for their divine pharaoh while you struggled with pain and exhaustion behind curtains of precious cloth, maintaining the sacred fiction that kept Egypt stable. Your hunting expeditions, immortalized in tomb paintings and temple reliefs, tell a particularly poignant story of the gap between image and reality. Traditional pharaonic art shows you standing triumphantly in your chariot, bow drawn, about to strike down lions, ostriches, and other dangerous game. These scenes followed artistic conventions that had depicted pharaohs as master hunters for over 1,000 years. But the reality was almost certainly far different. Your physical condition would have made it impossible to draw a powerful hunting bow or maintain balance in a racing chariot. Most likely, you were carried to carefully staged hunting grounds where weakened or captive animals were released for you to kill at close range, allowing court artists to create the heroic images that political necessity demanded. The treasures that would eventually fill your tomb were being collected throughout your reign, each object chosen not just for its beauty or value, but for its symbolic meaning in the afterlife. The golden chariots buried with you were probably never used for actual warfare or hunting, but served as props for the artistic fantasies that sustained your public image. The weapons included in your burial goods, magnificent examples of the craftsman's art, were likely ceremonial pieces rather than functional tools of war. Even in death, the gap between the pharaoh of official propaganda and the reality of your lived experience would be preserved for eternity. Your education during these years would have been unlike that of any previous Egyptian prince. Most royal children learned statecraft, military strategy, and religious doctrine over decades of preparation for eventual rule. You were forced to master these subjects while simultaneously exercising the power they were meant to prepare you for. Imagine trying to learn hieroglyphic writing while signing state documents that would affect thousands of lives, or studying military tactics while generals waited for your approval of their battle plans. The pressure to appear knowledgeable and decisive while still acquiring the most basic skills of kingship must have been overwhelming. The correspondence that flowed from your court to foreign rulers reveals the careful balance your advisors maintained between projecting strength and managing your limitations. Letters to the kings of Assyria, Babylon, and the Hittite Empire were written in your name, but crafted by experienced diplomats who understood the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shaped international relations. These documents present you as a confident young monarch, fully in control of Egypt's destiny. But they were actually products of committee authorship designed to hide your youth and inexperience from foreign eyes that might view weakness as opportunity. Your queen Ankhesenamun faced her own tragic circumstances during these years. She had already endured the trauma of marriage to her own father, witnessed the collapse of the Amarna Revolution, and now found herself wed to another family member who was himself struggling with the impossible demands of kingship. The loss of your two daughters would have devastated her as much as it did you, but her grief had to remain private while she continued to fulfill her public role as Egypt's divine queen. The few artistic depictions of your relationship show tender moments between a young couple, but these images may have represented wishful thinking rather than reality. The priest who had regained power through your restoration of traditional religion watched your declining health with growing concern. Their return to influence depended entirely on your continued reign and your commitment to the old gods. If you died without an heir, if succession passed to someone less committed to traditional religion, or if political chaos followed your death, they risked losing everything they had regained. Their prayers for your health and longevity were motivated as much by self-interest as by genuine devotion, adding another layer of complexity to your relationship with the religious establishment you had empowered. Your military commanders faced similar dilemmas as your health deteriorated. The campaigns they had fought in your name to restore Egypt's empire had been largely successful, but maintaining control over reconquered territories required continued strong leadership from Memphis. Foreign rulers who had submitted to Egyptian authority might be tempted to rebel if they perceived weakness at the heart of the empire. The warrior pharaoh they had presented to Egypt's enemies was a carefully constructed fiction that became harder to maintain as your physical condition worsened. The economic prosperity that your reign had restored to Egypt after the chaos of the Amarna period was similarly dependent on perceptions of stability and strength. Trade routes that had been reopened, tribute that had been restored, and commercial relationships that had been rebuilt could all collapse if foreign merchants and local governors lost confidence in Egypt's leadership. Your advisors worked tirelessly to project an image of continuity and strength while privately preparing for various succession scenarios that might preserve the kingdom's stability. The artistic renaissance that flourished during your reign represented both a return to traditional Egyptian aesthetics and a subtle propaganda campaign designed to legitimize your rule. The temples rebuilt in your name, the statues carved in your image, and the reliefs depicting your alleged achievements were all part of a massive public works project that demonstrated Egypt's renewed prosperity while creating visual narratives that supported your authority. But for you, personally, these artistic celebrations of your reign must have felt like beautiful lies, magnificent monuments to a pharaoh who existed more in imagination than in reality. Your personal possessions, many of which would eventually accompany you to the afterlife, tell a story of a young man trying to find joy and meaning despite overwhelming circumstances. The board games found in your tomb suggest moments of leisure snatched from the relentless demands of kingship. The musical instruments buried with you hint at private pleasures that provided escape from public duties. The books and scrolls included in your burial goods may represent genuine intellectual interest that you pursued when royal obligations permitted. But even these personal items were carefully chosen by advisors who understood their symbolic significance in the afterlife. Nothing in a pharaoh's tomb was purely personal. Everything served political, religious, or dynastic purposes that extended beyond your individual preferences. The board games weren't just entertainment, but symbols of your wisdom and strategic thinking. The musical instruments represented your cultural refinement and divine inspiration. The books demonstrated your learning and piety. Even in death, you would continue to serve the propaganda needs of the office that had consumed your life. The medical treatments you received during your final years represent the best that ancient Egyptian medicine could offer. But they were primitive by modern standards and probably caused as much suffering as they relieved. The surgical instruments buried with you suggest that physicians attempted various procedures to address your health problems, but without understanding of infection, anesthesia, or the underlying genetic causes of your conditions, these interventions were likely futile and painful. The medicines included in your tomb, while representing sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge for the time, would have provided only temporary relief for symptoms, rather than addressing root causes of your declining health. Your final months as pharaoh would have been marked by increasing desperation, as your advisors realized that time was running out to secure the succession and preserve the stability they had worked so hard to achieve. Alternative plans would have been discussed in secret meetings from which you were probably excluded despite being the central figure around whom everything revolved. The very people who had spent your entire reign treating you as a divine figurehead were now forced to confront the reality that you were a mortal teenager whose death would leave Egypt without clear leadership. The religious rituals surrounding your final illness would have been elaborate and desperate, combining traditional healing ceremonies with magical practices designed to preserve your life at any cost. Priests would have performed daily offerings to every god in the Egyptian pantheon, seeking divine intervention that might save their pharaoh and preserve their own positions. The temples you had rebuilt would have echoed with prayers for your recovery, but the gods remained as silent as they had throughout your troubled reign. Your queen Akhenaten must have watched your decline with a mixture of genuine grief and growing terror about her own future. As the widow of a pharaoh who died without male heirs, she would become a valuable political prize for whoever emerged as your successor, but she would have little control over her own destiny. The woman who had already endured two forced marriages within her own family faced the prospect of yet another political union that would serve dynastic interests rather than her personal wishes. The treasures being prepared for your tomb during these final months represented not just wealth, but a desperate attempt to ensure your successful transition to the afterlife. If the gods had failed to protect you in life, perhaps they could be persuaded to grant you the eternal existence that every pharaoh desired. The elaborate burial preparations that would make your tomb the richest ever discovered were motivated by genuine religious belief, but also by political calculation. A magnificent burial would demonstrate Egypt's continued prosperity and divine favor, even in the face of their young pharaoh's tragic death. As your 18th birthday approached in 1323 BC, the weight of unfulfilled potential must have been crushing. You had ruled Egypt for nearly a decade without ever truly controlling your own destiny. You had restored the traditional gods without receiving their protection. You had rebuilt the empire without enjoying its power. You had married your sister without finding companionship. You had tried to produce heirs without success. The golden mask that would cover your face in death would be more real than the divine authority you had worn in life. The final irony of your existence was about to unfold. In death, you would achieve the fame and recognition that had eluded you in life, but for all the wrong reasons. Your tomb, hidden and forgotten by those who wanted to erase your reign from history, would survive intact, while the monuments of greater pharaohs crumbled into dust. The boy king who had been manipulated and controlled by others would become the most famous pharaoh of all time, his golden treasures touring the world as symbols of ancient Egypt's glory. But by then, it would be far too late for you to appreciate the cruel joke that history had played on your memory. The morning of your death dawned like any other in the palace at Memphis. Servants moved through corridors with practiced silence, preparing for another day of carefully orchestrated royal routine. The physicians who had attended you through months of declining health arrived to find your breathing shallow, your pulse weak, but your eyes still holding that spark of intelligence that had carried you through 9 years of impossible kingship. They mixed their potions and muttered their prayers, but deep down, they knew what your advisors had been whispering for weeks. The boy pharaoh was dying, and with him died the last direct link to the bloodline that had both created and destroyed the Amarna Revolution. Your final hours were spent not in the company of friends or loved ones, but surrounded by the same political figures who had managed your entire reign. I, the elderly advisor who had guided your return to traditional religion, stood at your bedside, calculating how quickly he could legitimize his own claim to the throne. Horemheb, the military commander who had rebuilt Egypt's army in your name, waited in the antechamber for news that would trigger the succession plans he had been secretly preparing for months. Even your wife, Akhenaten, the only person who might have genuinely mourned your passing, was surrounded by courtiers already discussing her political value in the coming power struggle. The official cause of your death would be recorded as fever, a conveniently vague explanation that avoided uncomfortable questions about the genetic weaknesses that had plagued your family line. But modern forensic analysis of your mummy tells a different story. Evidence of a severe head injury, possibly from a chariot accident or hunting mishap, suggests that your end may have come suddenly rather than from the long illness that had weakened you for years. Whether this injury was accidental or intentional remains one of history's great mysteries, but the timing was certainly convenient for those who stood to benefit from your death. The moment your breath stopped, the elaborate machinery of royal succession that had been prepared in secret sprang into action with ruthless efficiency. Before your body had even begun to cool, messengers were racing across Egypt, carrying sealed orders to governors, military commanders, and temple administrators. The official mourning period would last 70 days, the time required for proper mummification, but the real business of transferring power began within hours of your death. Your queen faced an impossible situation that perfectly encapsulated the tragic nature of your entire family's fate. As the widow of a pharaoh who had died without male heirs, she was simultaneously the most valuable woman in Egypt and the most vulnerable. Ancient law and custom dictated that whoever married her would have the strongest claim to the throne, making her a prize to be won rather than a person with agency over her own future. The letters she apparently sent to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh of Egypt, reveal her desperation to escape the web of palace intrigue that had already consumed so many members of her family. But even this desperate gambit failed. The Hittite prince who was sent to Egypt in response to her pleas was murdered before he could reach Memphis, almost certainly on the orders of Egyptian officials who had no intention of allowing foreign rule. With this last hope of independence destroyed, Akhenaten was forced into marriage with Ai, your elderly advisor who was old enough to be her grandfather. This union legitimized his claim to the throne while condemning her to yet another loveless political marriage. She disappears from historical records shortly after this wedding, another casualty of the dynastic politics that had shaped and destroyed your entire generation. The mummification of your body became a race against time and political necessity. Your advisors needed to demonstrate that proper religious protocols were being followed while simultaneously consolidating their own power and erasing inconvenient aspects of your reign. The embalmers who worked on your corpse were sworn to secrecy about what they discovered. Modern analysis suggests they did their job hastily, possibly to conceal evidence of trauma that might have raised awkward questions about the circumstances of your death. The 70 days of mummification also provided time for your successors to begin the systematic destruction of your historical legacy. Inscriptions bearing your name were chiseled away from temple walls and replaced with those of later pharaohs. Statues depicting you were either destroyed or modified to represent different rulers. Official king lists compiled during subsequent reigns would simply skip from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, erasing both you and your father from the official record of pharaonic succession. The damnatio memoriae that had been applied to Akhenaten was now extended to include his entire family line. Your tomb in the Valley of the Kings was prepared with unprecedented haste for a pharaoh's burial. Most royal tombs took years or even decades to complete, with elaborate decorations and vast chambers designed to house the accumulated treasures of a long reign. Your burial site was much smaller and simpler, suggesting it may have been originally intended for a noble rather than a king. The walls were painted quickly with scenes from the Amduat, the ancient Egyptian book of the afterlife, but the artwork lacks the refinement typical death. You were being treated as a minor figure of royal tombs, even in rather than a true pharaoh. Yet the treasures buried with you tell a different story. The 5,000 objects packed into your tomb's 4 small chambers represent one of the greatest concentrations of wealth ever assembled for a single burial. Golden chariots, jeweled daggers, elaborate furniture, and countless precious objects filled every available space. The famous golden mask that covered your mummified face alone contained over 20 pounds of pure gold. This extraordinary wealth seems contradictory given your marginalized status, but it likely represents a guilty conscience on the part of your successors who were simultaneously erasing your memory and trying to ensure your successful journey to the afterlife. The burial ceremony itself would have been a masterpiece of political theater. All the traditional rituals of pharaonic interment were performed with proper solemnity, demonstrating respect for the institution of kingship, even while preparing to erase the specific king being buried. High priest intoned ancient prayers for your eternal rest, while privately supporting the new regime that would marginalize your religious reforms. Military honor guards escorted your golden coffin while their commanders planned campaigns that would be credited to your successors rather than your reign. Your burial chamber was sealed with the traditional warnings against disturbing the pharaoh's rest, but these curses were probably unnecessary. Within a generation, your tomb's location had been forgotten, buried under debris from the construction of later royal tombs. The deliberate amnesia that erased your name from official records also erased knowledge of where you had been buried. Your successors achieved something remarkable in the annals of ancient Egyptian history. They managed to hide a pharaoh's tomb so effectively that it remained lost for over 3,000 years. I, who succeeded you as pharaoh despite having no royal blood, ruled for only 4 years before dying of old age. His brief reign was spent consolidating the counter-revolution that had begun during your minority. completing the return to traditional religion and erasing the last traces of the Amarna period. Horemheb, who followed Ai to the throne, proved more effective at establishing a lasting dynasty, but he too was haunted by the need to legitimize his rule by demonizing everything associated with Akhenaten's religious revolution, including your own reign. The historical narrative that emerged during the reigns of your successors painted the entire Amarna period as a time of chaos and heresy, from which Egypt had been rescued by strong traditional leadership. You were relegated to a footnote in this story, mentioned only as the weak boy king, who had been manipulated by evil advisors before wise counselors restored proper order. Even this minimal acknowledgement would eventually disappear, as later pharaohs found it more convenient to pretend you had never existed at all. The irony of your posthumous fate would have been crushing had you been able to witness it. The pharaoh who had spent his entire reign trying to restore Egypt's traditional greatness was being systematically erased by those who claimed to share that goal. The boy who had sacrificed his childhood to serve his kingdom's interest was being denied even the basic recognition that he had existed. Your name, already changed once during your lifetime to serve political purposes, was being chiseled away from monuments and removed from official records as if you had been nothing more than a fever dream in Egypt's long history. Yet beneath the deliberate amnesia imposed by your successors, traces of your reign persisted in unexpected places. Local governors in distant provinces continued to date documents according to your regnal years, long after your death, either from bureaucratic inertia or quiet resistance to the official erasure of your memory. Ordinary Egyptians who had prospered during the restoration of traditional trade and religious practices remembered you fondly, even if they couldn't speak your name aloud. The temples you had rebuilt continued to function and flourish, their very existence serving as inadvertent monuments to your reign, even after your name was removed from their dedication inscriptions. The archaeological record tells its own story of deliberate destruction and accidental preservation. Statues bearing your likeness were systematically destroyed, but fragments survived in foundation deposits and refuse pits where your successors' agents failed to find them. Papyri mentioning your reign were burned or recycled, but scraps survived as mummy wrappings or construction material where they lay forgotten for millennia. The very thoroughness of the campaign to erase your memory ensured that traces would survive for modern archaeologists to discover and decode. Your tragic story might have remained forever obscured if not for a series of historical accidents that preserved evidence of your existence. The rapid succession of short-lived pharaohs following the Amarna period created bureaucratic confusion that allowed some records to survive. The eventual collapse of the New Kingdom led to the abandonment of administrative archives where documents mentioning your reign lay undisturbed. Most importantly, the loss of your tomb's location meant that its treasures escaped the systematic plundering that emptied the burial sites of more famous pharaohs. The rediscovery of your tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter represented a moment of cosmic justice that you could never have anticipated. The boy pharaoh, whose memory had been deliberately erased, suddenly became the most famous ruler of ancient Egypt. Your golden treasures, hidden for over 3 millennia, emerged into a world hungry for tangible connections to the ancient past. The mask that had covered your mummified face became one of the most recognizable images in human history, adorning museum walls, book covers, and tourist advertisements around the globe. But this posthumous fame came with its own tragic ironies. The treasures that made you famous were displayed in museums far from Egypt, separated from the land you had ruled and the gods you had served. Your mummified body became a subject of scientific study rather than eternal rest, examined by techniques that would have horrified the priests who had prepared you for the afterlife. The boy who had longed for privacy and normal childhood became the most scrutinized pharaoh in history, his physical remains subjected to CT scans and DNA analysis that revealed intimate details about his health, parentage, and death. Modern Egyptology has gradually reconstructed the story of your reign from fragments of evidence that survived the ancient campaign to erase your memory. Inscriptions in remote temples, administrative documents from provincial archives, and diplomatic correspondence from foreign courts have slowly revealed the outline of your tragic life. Yet significant gaps remain in our understanding, ensuring that you retain an air of mystery even as you have become ancient Egypt's most famous pharaoh. The medical analysis of your mummy has transformed our understanding of the human cost of royal inbreeding and the genetic problems that plagued your family line. Your physical abnormalities, once hidden behind the facade of divine kingship, now serve as evidence for the scientific study of hereditary disorders in ancient populations. The boy who was forced to project superhuman strength and divine perfection has become a case study in human vulnerability and the medical consequences of dynastic politics. Your story resonates with modern audiences precisely because it reveals the human reality behind the golden facade of pharaonic power. The lonely child struggling with impossible expectations, the teenager forced into adult responsibilities while battling chronic illness, the young man whose personal tragedies were subordinated to political necessity. These themes transcend the specific circumstances of ancient Egypt and speak to universal experiences of isolation, exploitation, and premature loss of innocence. The letters your widow allegedly sent to foreign rulers, begging for escape from the political web that had consumed her family, provide a rare glimpse into the emotional reality of royal women whose lives were entirely controlled by dynastic considerations. Her fate serves as a reminder that the victims of ancient politics were not just the pharaohs themselves, but everyone caught in the machinery of power that ground up individuals in service to abstract concepts of kingship and divine authority. The systematic destruction of your historical legacy by your own successors reveals the ruthless nature of ancient politics and the lengths to which rulers would go to legitimize their own authority. The pharaohs who claimed to restore Egypt's greatness after the chaos of the Amarna period were willing to erase a decade of history and deny the existence of their predecessor to maintain their preferred narrative of restoration and renewal. Yet the ultimate failure of this campaign of historical erasure demonstrates the difficulty of completely controlling memory and the persistence of truth even in the face of deliberate suppression. The fragments that survived, the traces that persisted, the accidents that preserved, all combined to ensure that your story would eventually be recovered and told, even if it took over 3,000 years for the world to listen. Your reign stands as a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the human cost of political systems that treat individuals as expendable resources in service to abstract ideals. The boy who should have been playing with toys instead wore the crown of Egypt. The teenager who should have been learning about life instead made decisions affecting millions. The young man who should have been discovering love instead endured arranged marriages designed to serve dynastic politics rather than human happiness. The treasures of your tomb, magnificent as they are, cannot compensate for the childhood you never had, the normal life you were denied, or the personal agency that was sacrificed to the demands of kingship. The golden mask that made you famous is beautiful, but it is also a symbol of the beautiful lies that surrounded your entire existence. The gap between the divine pharaoh of official propaganda and the suffering child who wore that crown. And so ends the story of Tutankhamun, the boy who became a forgotten pharaoh only to emerge from obscurity as the most famous ruler of ancient Egypt. His life reminds us that behind every crown lies a human being, that beneath every golden mask beats a heart capable of suffering, and that sometimes the greatest tragedies unfold not in the dramatic collapse of empires, but in the quiet sacrifice of individual dreams to the relentless demands of power. The pharaoh who was erased from history ultimately achieved immortality, teaching us that truth, like gold, has a way of surviving even when buried under millennia of sand and silence.